Hello and welcome to day 24 of our Read Through the Bible in a Year process. We will be looking at Exodus chapter 9 to 11 and Luke chapter 24 today. In Exodus, we are continuing our way through the plagues. We got through the first four, so we are in the second triad, the second set of three plagues of the 10. The fifth one is animals. Now, once again, Egyptians are feeling the burden of this plague, but not the Israelites. But a whole bunch of animals are affected by this for the Egyptians. The sixth one is boils, a terrible skin affliction. And again, all of the Egyptians are feeling this. Now, remember, all of this is happening so that God is showing his power to both Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but also to the Israelites. We now move into the third triad. Now, these are really done by Moses working with God's power. And the seventh one is hail. Now, this one, as we said before, the first couple often come with a warning. So there's a warning that hail is coming. It's going to be a terrible storm. And if you are caught out in the open, you could die. Your animals could die. Your crops are going to be destroyed. So there's a warning, and some of the Egyptians have started figuring out that maybe Moses' God, Yahweh, Adonai, has got a lot of power and we should maybe pay attention. And so there were Egyptians that moved to shelter, moved their animals to shelter, tried to get some of their crops out of the field to try and protect things. So there was a growing respect for God that is starting to emerge at this time. Pharaoh, after this one, is like, you know what? Make it stop and I will let you go. The problem here is that Pharaoh doesn't stick with that, and Pharaoh rescinds his release pretty quickly. However, this is a major escalation. There were some people that died from the hail, and so God is definitely showing the consequences of resisting God's authority. The eighth plague is locusts. Now, we don't have swarms of locusts in the United States anymore, but we have had them in the past, and it is a terrible, terrible affliction. They eat everything, and I mean everything. They are nasty, they are annoying to have around, and then everything is devastated by the time they're done and they move on. Once again, we hear about how God is making Pharaoh stubborn so that the people could see the power of the God of the Israelites' God, and the Israelites themselves are really starting to also understand who this God is. They've been living in Israel so long, you could say they've been Egyptified. They frankly know more about the Egyptians' gods than they know about the God of Abraham. And so God really wants them to start understanding who God is and what God's power is. Now, Pharaoh's advisors have started believing in Moses' God, and they are asking for the Israelites' release. So not only is Moses and the Israelites begging for release, but Pharaoh's own advisors and consultants are wanting the release. Finally, we get to the ninth plague, and this is a plague of darkness. Now, in one of the text, it talks about the darkness that you can touch. And so there is some thought that this is perhaps a Hamsin or a dust storm that has come out of the Sahara. And that the darkness is because the dust has blotted out the sun, but there's so much dust in the air, it's very hard to breathe, but you can actually touch the darkness. And of course, then we will be looking at the final plague in our next reading. In Luke chapter 24, Jesus has died and has been buried, and we now read about how the men go to the tomb, or the women are going to the tomb to care for the body and discover that the body is gone. They return to the men and say, hey, Jesus is gone. There were some messengers there who said that he's risen from the dead, and the guys are like, you guys are just babbling, whatever. And they don't believe the women. Now, I think there's a lesson in this for us today, because sometimes we hear messages from God from people that we don't expect to hear messages from God, and we don't believe them. We don't take them seriously. We don't really listen to what they're saying. And I think in this case, it's men not listening to women. That is often a problem we still have today, where men don't listen to women. But sometimes it's because of the age of a person. They're older, they're younger. Maybe it's because of their national origin. Maybe it's the accent they use. Maybe it's they have a different religious background from our own. But I think we need to be careful that just as the men did not listen to the women in this case, there are times when we are not listening to people that God is using to tell us something, and we need to be aware of that. I think one big area that we need to be concerned that we're not listening is the number of youth that have become climate activists who are desperately trying to get major corporations and governments to make policy changes in order to do something about climate change. For the youth, they're the ones that they know have to live with the climate changes that are coming, with the increased disasters, with the flooding, with the droughts. They don't know what life is going to be like for themselves, their children, and their grandchildren. And I think they are really challenging those of us who are older that we really need to get involved and do something about caring for God's creation. And so this would be a modern day example of a group of people that perhaps we are challenged to listen more carefully to. As we continue in this Luke chapter, we have the walk to Emmaus, where some of the followers of Jesus are returning home. They have not heard that Jesus' body is missing, that something has happened. Jesus shows up and is walking with them, and they're talking as they walk. And I find it interesting, especially as we are reading through Exodus at the same time right now, that Jesus uses Moses as the starting point for the story that he is sharing, explaining where Jesus came from and where Jesus fits in. He doesn't start with Abraham or Jacob. He starts with Moses. And I think what Moses is doing to deliver his people from Egypt is the parallel to what Jesus is doing is for delivering us from the power of death and sin. And so I think that's interesting and something to think about as we continue reading about Moses. One of the things for us to consider are the Pharisees in some ways acting like Pharaoh. Are the Pharisees people with a hardened heart? Are there perhaps moments when God has hardened the hearts of Pharisees? They are behaving as stubbornly and obstinately as Pharaoh. But is part of this happening so that we can see the power of Jesus? We can see the mercy and the compassion and the grace of Jesus? Chapter 24 and the whole book of Luke ends in verse 52 with Jesus returning to heaven. And then verse 53, it says, day by day they gathered praying and giving thanks to God. I think sometimes we worry so much about how do we run church and how do we do church and how do we organize our church and how do we pull together all of the resources to be church. And I think verse 53 helps us remember that church is about being the body of Jesus on earth today. We are here to continue doing Jesus' work, and we do it by gathering together regularly. All of those who are like, oh, I don't have time for this. God is with us. Jesus is with us when at least 2 or 3 of us gather in God's name to pray and to give thanks to God. Frequently, they were gathering around a meal. So as we're thinking about our super busy lives today, first of all, I think we have to decide, are we busier than we need to be, than what God is calling us to be? Do we need to be making more time for God in our lives? But second of all, how are we gathering with other believers? Now, some of us go into church for an hour on Sunday morning. Okay, maybe that's not entirely our cup of tea, but we can gather. We can gather for morning coffee, for lunch. We can have a drink after work in the evenings. When do we get together with other people on a regular basis where we are praying together, where we are studying together, where we are making plans to do Jesus' work in the world together? And I think there's a way that every one of us can find space for that in our lives. If we're a family with little kids running around, maybe our study time is when we read the Bible together or read Bible stories with our kids before going to bed. And every month we try to find something that we can go out and help our community. Maybe we go and pick up sticks and garbage along a walking trail along the river. Maybe we go help out at a food pantry putting the food away. There's many things we can do even with kids who are pretty little, that can still be helpful to our neighbors who have physical needs that need to be met. I look forward to seeing you next time.